It is Sunday, the 2nd of February 2020. That is Groundhog Day, and I have a long tradition of exposing the shadow of Unitarian Universalist clergy abuse and various other Unitarian Universalist injustices and abuses on Groundhog Day. I've been doing that for quite some time now on the Emerson Avenger blog. If you just search Unitarian Universalists and Groundhog Day in the Emerson Avenger, you'll find some pertinent blog posts that were posted on Groundhog Day and are about Unitarian Universalist clergy abuse and the shadow, in every sense of the word shadow, of Unitarian Universalist clergy abuse. And unfortunately, the shadow is still very much there. The Unitarian Universalist Association, the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association, numerous Unitarian Universalist congregations, and an undetermined number of individual Unitarian Universalist ministers and ordinary Unitarian Universalist lay people and lay leaders go to rather foolish lengths to try and keep the shadow hidden, keep it suppressed, keep it out of the public eye, and so on. And, you know, to some degree they're successful. To some degree they're able to keep the shadow hidden. But instead of keeping the shadow hidden, what they should be doing is responsibly doing what is necessary to clean up the mess. All too often, Unitarian Universalists, instead of dealing responsibly with clergy misconduct complaints, some of which include some pretty serious sexual misconduct. I mean, there's a whole range of sexual misconduct, ranging from comparatively low-end sexual harassment right up to what the Unitarian Universalist Association's Canadian attorney describes as such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape. And these picket signs that I'm holding provide just one example of how the Unitarian Universalist Association in Boston tried to keep such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape hidden from the public. On June 1st of 2012, I received in my email inbox an email from Stikeman Elliott Barristers and Solicitors defamation lawyer, Maitre Marc-Andre Coulombe, and amongst other highly questionable false accusations as far as I'm concerned, he falsely accused me of violating Canada's blasphemy law in an effort to intimidate me into taking down the Emerson Avenger blog post that told the readily verifiable truth about child sex abuse committed by Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell and Richard Buell of First Parish Norwell, and also to intimidate me into not making any more blog posts about any other Unitarian Universalist sex offenders. The exact words of Maitre Coulombe's false accusation of violating the blasphemy law said, "Your unfounded and vicious allegations to the effect that ministers of the association engage in such despicable crimes as pedophilia and rape are defamatory." And it went on to suggest that they were so defamatory that they constituted the criminal act of blasphemous libel. When I saw the term blasphemous libel, I didn't know exactly what that was. I know what blasphemous meant, I know what libel meant, but I'd never seen them together in a phrase like that, blasphemous libel. He didn't mention that it was a crime, he just said they constitute blasphemous libel. So I Googled blasphemous libel and found that, in fact, you know, at the time, in June of 2012, Canada had an anti-blasphemy law embedded in the Canadian Criminal Code, which essentially prohibited insulting a religion. And essentially, Reverend Marc-Andre Coulombe, the UUA's Canadian attorney, was accusing me of blaspheming against Unitarian Universalism because I'd told the readily verifiable truth about Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell's being convicted of the forcible rape of teenage Tibetan refugees, and also how Richard Buell, a parishioner of Reverend Dr. Victoria Weinstein at First Parish Norwell, had been charged, tried, and convicted of basically pedophilia, of sexual abuse of very young children. Their ages were estimated as being somewhere between 6 and 9 at the times that the rapes took place. This is absolutely a pedophile rapist. I did use that term to describe Richard Buell, because that's exactly what he was, and he was convicted of it. And yet here's the UUA trying to pretend that my blog posts about Mac Mitchell and Richard Buell are unfounded. In fact, everything that was in them was based on newspaper reports that I had found online, as well as some other information. But there was very, apparently reliable news reports in different media that clearly stated, that Reverend Mac Wallace Mitchell had been convicted of the rape, indeed forcible rape, and indeed unnatural rape, if you want to figure out what that means, of a teenage Tibetan refugee that he had lured away from her family in India with promises of a better life in America. He had basically systematically raped her over a period measured in years. I think he brought her to America when she was 16, and he proceeded to use her as a sex slave until she finally had enough of it in her early 20s. So basically he used her as a sex slave for at least 4 or 5 years, maybe 6. I'm just going to check and see if this thing's still recording. And it is. Okay, so we're on a roll here. So as I said, I'm in front of the Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist Church in Lachine. I'm basically keeping up my Groundhog Day tradition of exposing the shadow of Unitarian Universalist clergy abuse and other Unitarian Universalist injustices and abuses. There's not just the clergy abuse itself, there's the failure and the refusal to deal responsibly with clergy misconduct when complaints are brought against ministers. The UUA and individual UU churches are constantly just brushing off complaints, or trying to silence complainants, or even trying to intimidate them into silence, as they've done with me. What's been done to me, I'm sure, has been done to other people. Maybe not to the extent of being accused of violating a blasphemy law, but I'm sure a certain number of Unitarian Universalist clergy abuse complainants or clergy abuse whistleblowers have been served with cease and desist demand letters, or coerced or cajoled into signing non-disclosure agreements. I do know, I've been reliably informed by Reverend Deborah Pope Lance, that it was basically the habit of the UUA to have clergy misconduct complainants sign NDAs. They basically refuse to act on complaints about clergy sexual misconduct unless the complainant signed a non-disclosure agreement. And what happened after that often is their complaints just got brushed off, but they were now bound to a non-disclosure agreement, so they couldn't even complain about the fact that the UUA had just, dismissed or rejected or otherwise, not properly handled their complaint because they were bound to an NDA. So this is quite outrageous as far as I'm concerned, and it's a current issue in the news with the, Weinstein case and other cases, where NDAs are a key component in silencing complainants and victims and so on. As far as it goes, it's been a little while since I protested here in front of the Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist Church. I was quite unable to in November and December with basically other things that I had to do on Sunday mornings. There were 1 or 2 occasions where I might have been able to, but there was also some bad weather and so on. So this is my first protest outside the Lakeshore Unitarian Church since November, and in that time there have been some very interesting developments that are certainly worth mentioning within this Groundhog Day context. In November, I became aware that the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association, or the Board of Trustees of the UUMA, had issued what they called a letter of apology for clergy sexual misconduct, and they had sent it out to all of their members on June 3rd of last year, 2019. So on June 3rd of 2019, the UUMA Board of Trustees sent out to, I presume, all members of the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association, so a whole bunch of Unitarian Universalist ministers, a so-called letter of apology for clergy sexual misconduct. Why they're sending a letter of apology for clergy misconduct to the ministers, some of whom are almost certainly guilty of clergy sexual misconduct, and others who may not themselves be directly guilty of clergy sexual misconduct, they're certainly guilty of helping the Unitarian Universalist religious community keep it hidden from the public and so on. You know, how an apology is sent to these people, I don't know. It looks very much like it was an exercise in damage control, risk management, basically trying to mollify Unitarian Universalist ministers, especially those in congregations that have been affected by clergy sexual misconduct at one time or another, and there's literally hundreds of those in the Unitarian Universalist Association, you know, basically trying to pretend to them that, oh, you know, we're apologizing and we're trying to make things right and things will be better and so on and so forth. Well, excuse me, you apologize to the wrong people. And there were serious problems in the apology itself. The apology, most ironically, apologized for minimizing clergy sexual misconduct. They used that exact word, minimizing or minimization. They basically acknowledged minimizing or the minimization of clergy sexual misconduct in the apology. Well, guess what? They're minimizing Unitarian Universalist clergy sexual misconduct and related issues, you know, such as the cover-up and denial, such as the intimidation and bullying of victims, you know, such as the basically trying to keep it hidden as much as possible. They're minimizing all of that, just using the word minimization or minimize. That alone is a minimization, but it got better, or should I say worse. They said that a few Unitarian Universalist ministers did not hold themselves to the utmost honesty and integrity. So there's a little problem there, in that a whole lot more than just a few Unitarian Universalist ministers are guilty of clergy sexual misconduct of one kind or another. There are literally hundreds of Unitarian Universalist ministers who are known to have committed some form of sexual misconduct, or at least there are hundreds of Unitarian Universalist congregations, a minimum of 400 according to information that I have that's quite reliable, and estimates as much as, you know, 600 or 700 or more of Unitarian Universalism's 1,000 congregations have been affected by clergy sexual misconduct at one time or another, and I doubt that was done by just a few Unitarian Universalist ministers. You know, I think it is probably some hundreds of Unitarian